Hey everyone, thanks again for joining us this week. Hopefully everybody's having a great week. So today we're going to talk about a subject that keeps coming up and up by a lot of people that people keep asking me about. And we've kind of talked around this subject in previous weeks, but I wanted to kind of really dive into what are the different roles on a game development team, not just in game design, but in game development in general. And, what is that job? Like, what do the people do in that job? How does that job vary from different jobs and different subjects like that? So today we're going to kind of try to tackle the difficult question of just kind of what are all these different roles and jobs and what interests you and things like that. So if you have questions about any particular roles or any of these particular jobs, please ask and speak up. But like I said, I have been getting a lot of questions about what's a game programmer versus a game designer versus a game artist, and things like that. So this week we're going to try to define those a little bit better and try to give you a little bit more hands-on about what are these different roles and how do they really truly differ and vary from one another. So hang in there. Hopefully this won't be too boring for everybody. I know for a lot of you this may be redundant, but please if you're new to this or have questions about it, please ask questions and I'll do my best to try to kind of really define what all these different jobs are, and kind of what it's like. Because in the end, if you're a student or someone who's looking to get into game development, the hard question is often which role, and job do I want to do? And, and the reality is that the right job for you is what interests you, what you're passionate about, and kind of what your skill sets are. And so it's really hard to advise people exactly on what job to do or what role to do, because it really is, are you artistic? Are you creative? Are you technical? And those kinds of things. Each job takes a very different set of skills. And so ultimately the right job for you is the one that appeals to you or sounds interesting, and it's really hard to advise people on the exact job without sort of knowing, what your skill set is. But let's try to tackle some of that today and kind of give you some ideas about what these different job roles are. And again, please, everybody, ask questions today and feel free to, tell me what you're not understanding or want to know more about, and I'll definitely jump in there and give you more ideas. So, first of all is a high-level overview today. We're going to talk predominantly about, the four, really core pillars of game development. That doesn't mean that any of the other jobs that we talk about today are less important or not, but I think there's four main areas where the majority of staff usually exists within a game project. The first of those is in production. So production is kind of all the roles around being a producer or somebody like that. And we'll talk in a minute about what that means. The second is in game design. Third is in game programming, and fourth in game art. And then there's a lot of other roles we'll talk about, from sound to marketing, sales, and things like that are also, critically important to, the success of most games. And, it really depends on, like how many people are in these roles, really depends on the team and the company. But I would say that, quite often right now you might see, 10 to 20% of a team being in design. You might see 20 to 30% of a team being in programming. And you might see, 5% of a team or something, a few people in production. Again, depending on the scale of the team. And what you're really seeing now is a significant number of game artists. And, some teams are, I would say, even 70% game artists, but that can be less than that. But there's definitely a huge number of game artists needed now, especially in AAA console game development. And we'll get into what all those different roles are and kind of how they differ. But just the sheer volume of content needed for these next generation games has definitely led to a significant increase in the amount of game art that's being produced. And just so you know, like on any game team, these roles could all be virtual. There is companies that can work 100%, remote and function. But that does get harder and harder the bigger the teams are. But a lot of these teams, especially on the art side, will often use art outsourcing companies, and you'll see that more predominantly outsourced than, say, game production or game engineering, which is occasionally outsourced, but is definitely harder to outsource because it's definitely something you need to sort of be there, in person to really do the most effectively. But again, with COVID and everything else that's happening, we are seeing a shift, in some of that. So, there is differences there that, just to be aware of. And, I think these roles and the jobs and the opportunities will continue to kind of change and fluctuate about where they're located and how people think about these roles more and more, especially now kind of, in this COVID world and the post-COVID world. I think a lot of, production methodologies, will be changing. And lastly, to be aware of, on some bigger teams, if you go to Ubisoft or especially some studios like that, one project might actually have anywhere from 5 to 10, I've heard even up to 15 different studios within that same company all working on the same project. And so they may have studios literally around the world working on these projects together. And so the logistical challenges for a lot of these jobs will shift or change greatly depending on, the more people involved, the bigger the teams, the more diverse the teams are as far as across different studios or across different companies, outsourcing companies, things like that. And so just be aware of that a lot of the roles we're going to talk about today can definitely shift and change depending on kind of who owns the project, who's really working on it, things like that. So just be aware of that there are some problems, there can be some problems in the exact definitions of these roles or the exact definition of stuff based on, again, if you're an internal or external employee, the level of your employee, so junior to, senior or lead, type level or director level type positions also affects these job roles. So we'll try today to talk about some of that. But keep in mind that there's no like exact industry standard, and so a lot of these definitions and things you have to be careful about, because what could be the role at one company or on one team might have the same job title at another company and really be a very different job, and what you're doing, kind of day to day. So be aware of that and kind of understand that these roles can be a little more flexible depending on, especially if you're like an indie versus a AAA on a really large team. Your jobs will go from more generalist to more specialist as you get on bigger and bigger teams. And so, for example, as a 3D modeler, I know teams that, where the 3D modeler only does 3D modeling and doesn't do his own texturing. Like they'll have another artist be the texturing artist. And so one guy will just model, one guy textures, and it's two different job roles. But I would say the vast majority of companies, that's generally one job, and somebody does both of those roles. But again, it can be a little bit different. It can shift. So you do need to be aware of when you're going out to get a new job or going out to look for your first job. Really look at the job descriptions and make sure that you're qualified and have the skill sets. And the more broad you are, the better it is. For example, I have friends that are animators, and all they do is animate. And part of the animation, which we'll get into, is the rigging and the setup of the character. So you have your digital character, and you have to set up the skeletal structures, the bones, and how that character can move. And a lot of animators I know cannot do rigging. That's like a technical part of the job, which they really should know, but often they don't. And so now, the company needs a rigger and an animator, and quite often that's not acceptable. And so some of my friends who are animators have had trouble getting jobs at other companies because those companies require them to rig. And they just didn't want to, they know motion, they know animation, they don't know rigging, and it's really held them back in their careers. And, and even then they still didn't bother to go out and learn how to rig. It was too technical for them, so just be aware of, again, that a lot of these jobs can sometimes be combined together, or they can be separated, again, depending on, the scope and scale of the company. So let's first jump into game design. Obviously, this is my area of expertise. I've been a game designer for almost 30 years, and have worked at companies that had 5 people, and I've worked at companies that were very big and very massive on teams that are hundreds of people, and kind of everything in between. And so I'll try to kind of give you an idea of what game design is about, what and what goes into game design at these various teams. But I do have some previous live streams and topics, that do go kind of deep into this subject. So if you're interested in kind of what it's like to be a game designer or things like that, please definitely check out some of my old live streams that are saved on YouTube. I think some of those will give you even more depth, and understanding on what a game designer does, day to day. So the first job role, I'll call it just game designer, and you'll see a lot of jobs or the title of just game designer out there. And what that generally is a generalist. So if somebody's hiring for just a game designer, more often than not, they want somebody that can do everything. They want somebody that can do system level design and level design and know all different aspects of gameplay, stuff, monetization, the whole 9 yards. And so when you see a job title, of just game designer, 9 times out of 10, they're looking for a generalist and somebody who has a lot of experience kind of in all areas. But again, sometimes that's just a generic term also used just to say they want somebody, and you need to read the job description and kind of see like, okay, what do they really need out of this specific thing? Because I've seen, for example, subspecialties on some bigger teams, which aren't listed here, but there's subspecialties of, say, somebody who does monetization, and it's a game designer who's fully, 100% just in the monetization of the game, or in the, like the revenue and even just the economy of the game. You'll occasionally find that person in like massively multiplayer games and some stuff like that. So there's still kind of dozens of sub jobs that I don't have listed here that could be possible, but they're pretty uncommon. And so that's why we're not going to get into every single possible job that there is in game design. And some jobs we'll get into a little bit later that kind of cross into game design, but it's arguable whether they're in the game design department versus in their own departments or what. So, for example, an interface designer, a UI UX designer, that person generally needs to be and have a good understanding of game design, and that's the most common definition or understanding of it. However, that being said, the UI UX designer role or that job at some companies is literally a game designer with a UI UX designer with a UI artist, and maybe somebody else, a UI programmer. So sometimes in some in some companies that's 4 jobs, and sometimes it's 3 or 2 or 1, and it just really depends on, again, how good that person is, and what that company, is capable, of hiring and affording, right? And so just be aware that kind of not absolutely everything is covered here. We will talk about UI UX a little bit later, because I kind of put it into its own special corner, just because it does cover a bunch of specialties that are not UI or not game design, right? So again, just be aware of that. And understand that there is still a bunch of other jobs in game design. But again, as a game designer, quite often you're kind of just that person that has to make the game fun, right? And it's hard because it's a very subjective job. And one of the biggest problems I have is that, as a game designer, you'll find that most executives and most people on a team that, and anyone that's ever played a game will often have an opinion about game design. They'll often tell you what is fun, what's not fun, what they like, what they don't like, that kind of thing. And that's good and bad. And so one of the problems in game design is that, everybody likes to give an opinion, and everybody likes to tell you what's right or wrong or what they like or don't like, and stuff in, that area, right? And so that whole what is fun is very subjective. It varies from country to country, region to region, genre to genre. And so the language, I'll say, of game design is really tricky, because it can be different from, a role-playing game to a shooter to a strategy game, to a puzzle game, an online game versus in a multiplayer versus single player. Everything shares a foundation of kind of what is fun, but really it's a different language, for each one. And so while a lot of those languages may be based on a lot of the same ideas and concepts and things like that, it'd be like knowing, literally like Spanish and Portuguese, right? They're very similar, but they're different. Or even English and French, or English and, other languages have some commonalities in them. But some are really close where you kind of understand some of the words, and then others are like totally different, right? And game design's that same way, where some game genres and some game systems and stuff are very similar, and others are drastically different. So they're it requires a lot of kind of subject matter knowledge, which is why being a game designer is more complicated than just sort of being a good generic game designer. Because if you haven't actually worked in that genre before, you may not be capable of actually working in that genre well. And so that's one of the harsh realities. So as a game system designer, this is basically kind of the same as a game designer, but I'm breaking out into a more specific role that you will see. And that as a game system designer, you're basically the one who's defining all of the minute-to-minute, second-to-second gameplay. How do you move? How do you shoot? Where can you go? How can you get there? How do you buy and sell things? How do you manage your inventory? All the stuff that really defines, the fun of the game and stuff. And those systems are way harder to design than most people realize. And I find that most of my students really struggle. They go into a lot of things thinking that, oh, this is really simple. I can define just this one thing, and how hard can that be? Like a first-person shooter. Some of them will say, oh, I just need, there's a gun. I push a button which pulls the trigger that shoots a bullet, and that bullet does damage, and then damages an enemy and kills it. And that's literally as deep as they think about it, and they don't realize that there is a significant amount of more knowledge and definition needed. Even combat and stuff in general, even movement has so many nuances and so many little things that everything you do in a game has to be a conscious choice by a game designer. And so that's where it gets really tricky. And so as a system designer, you're really working in paper words, quite a bit, or spreadsheets, sometimes presentations, but you're generally working in kind of on paper to define all of these things, define all the systems, design all the edge cases, all that kind of stuff is important. And so again, it's one of those deceptive jobs, in that quite often you will get like what you think is 80% into it, and you think you're almost done, and then you still end up spending like 80% of the more time doing that last 20%, because you'll quickly realize at some point, like, hey, my system didn't quite work, and I have to either start over, or I got to do something new or different, that kind of thing. And solving a bunch of edge cases and stuff like that as a system designer is one of the hardest parts of the job. So it's like a big puzzle, and you're trying to put all these pieces together and figure out how they're all going to work perfectly together, and then do it in a manner that your team has the resources and time and everything to even do that, and so it can be really hard to design the game systems a lot it's, like I said, it's a lot harder than people realize, and it's definitely something that requires a lot of foundation. And so I've seen some game schools and some, different things out there where they try to, they spend 5 minutes on game system design and think that, you can just sort of say, well, you just got to go design the game and that's all there is to it. But it's actually definitely a very complex job with a lot of skills, and and it's going to require, again, a lot more kind of politics and negotiating and navigation, because everybody and their mother is going to give you feedback, advice, and things like that, which makes it really hard. Unlike, say a programmer, most executives or most people are not going to go look at their code and tell them if their coding is good or bad. Same thing with an artist. Occasionally an executive or somebody might have an opinion on if the art's good or bad, but as long as it's consistent and, and halfway decent, most people will just be like, yeah, okay, it looks good. So unless it's dramatically off. And so, but game design is one of those things where, again, it's about fun, and fun is a lot more subjective even than art. And so just be aware of that can be a big problem for game designers. Now, a level designer is basically kind of that second part of being a game designer. And a level designer is the person who, as the name implies, is the person who builds a level or the world. Sometimes they're called world designers. There can be a lot of different names that are kind of related to this, but basically they are usually the person that comes up with the concept for the level or area or whatever it is. It could be an open world game, so it could just be regions, that are being designed by different designers. It could literally be a level that's a separate thing that loads, and even down to some teams, even a puzzle game. You take a match 3 game or something, and they may still think of each level as a puzzle or something like that. So it's really kind of the name level designers, a little bit of a generic term, meaning the person that assembles the thing that everybody plays, right? And so that's really what a level designer does. They go from the paper concept, like in words of what is that thing going to be, usually to a 2D map of some kind, usually then to a white box, and then, and then various states of refinement as you get farther and farther into it. So that's, where the job of a level designer, there's a lot of iteration, a lot of progression. The other challenge with being a level designer is that you're usually or quite often the very last person on the team to touch things. Now, maybe a level artist might polish a level after you, but quite often you're kind of one of the last people to go in. And if everything else gets delayed, often your time doesn't get lengthened. You just get shorter and shorter time to do the same job. And that's why level design can be one of the more challenging and frustrating roles, just because you're waiting and you can't start often until the engine's ready and some art's ready and things like that. So you're often waiting for other people nervously so that you can begin. All right, so Boyan, thanks for joining us. Hopefully I pronounced your name right. So good for you. Applied for a junior level designer at Ubisoft. So, knowledge-wise, as far as a level designer, I think it's complicated. The knowledge that you need to have there is what makes a level fun, right? What makes an area fun? What makes something fun? And so I always tell people to start off with knowing how to design that level, even in words. Okay, what are the things that I need in that level? What do I need that level to do, or what do I need it for a functionality standpoint? So even trying to define what the story and the quests and that kind of stuff within this region are going to be, and then what's needed to support that. If I'm supposed to kill the bad guy that's in a castle, then I know I need a bad guy, I need a castle, right? And then, and then at some point I'll draw a rough map and say, okay, bad guy and castle are here. But I might also need a city, because a city might be where I buy and sell things. And, and so I know that I need this support area, for the player. So I might need to find another city, over here, or a particular vendor, and things like that. There may be a bunch of monsters, like a dragon that I got to kill. And so I know I need to have a dragon somewhere, and so you're kind of defining what these things are. And then that ability to visualize these things. And this is where sometimes you do this on your own. Sometimes you do it in conjunction with a level artist. But you basically need to start understanding visually, at least within spatial awareness, how big is everything? Like how big can a map be? Where do things kind of need to go, and the player paths and stuff, and how they're going to get there. Hi Chupa, thanks for joining us. And so you're kind of progressing that knowledge of, again, like how and why is the player going to say go here? How do I progress the player through a level, and get him to move around the entire level, for example? Every game is a little different. Some games, the levels are very linear, right? Some games, there's backtracking. Some games are hub and spoke where I'm going out. Ubisoft games are usually more open world, right? And so you have to kind of define, like, well, can I always go up here, or do I need to be like a certain level, or have a certain skill set or a certain item or something that I shouldn't go here until I reach, some level of accomplishment with my character. And then you might have other levels that are different things. And so the player may come through a particular area and go up here to start, but he knows to kind of avoid over here. And then later on, he's going to go travel to maybe a whole other area and then come back again when he's ready to go up here, right? And so, so your skill set is really then about, like, how do I build out these levels? How do I make them, look good and function really, really well? And so there is usually some knowledge or skill set in art, which really helps. So again, you may be on a team like at Ubisoft, you have a larger team. And so you're generally are going to be paired with a level artist or a team of artists who can help you define what does this level need to look like to even represent, especially if you go into real world, like how do the hills and valleys work together? How is this river going to come down a hill and into the lake? And how do the trees grow, and how does that change over the steepness of a mountain to a snowy mountaintop all the way down to the valley floor? It's not going to necessarily be, if it's a really tall mountain, the same ecosystems throughout that, right? And so having that knowledge as a level designer and understanding how to build worlds that are believable and artistically pleasing and look really good is something that you need to be aware of. You may not necessarily need to be an expert on, but you have to at least be talking to your art teams and understanding, what does a level look like, and how is it going to be built, and do you need it to be super realistic or not? So there's a lot of that kind of skill that goes involved with it. And depending on how the team is structured, again, with level artists and level designers, I've seen both methodologies applied in that sometimes the last person into a level is the level designer. And what a level artist does is he builds all the Legos. He builds all these building blocks for you. And then you as a level designer just go place everything. And you're not making the actual art, but you're putting down all the pieces. You put down the house, the trees, the rocks, and that kind of stuff. And so you have to have some aesthetic sense for how do I put things down. And so as we get into more realistic levels, that skill set becomes more and more needed, because you can't just necessarily put a tree down in the middle of nowhere and make it look good, right? You might need to have some rocks around it, and you might need to have some flowers and have some other things around it and stuff like that, right? So you need to just you may need some artistic sense. But again, you may have an artist who you just rough out a level for, and then they go in and do all that final work. So it's hard to tell you 100% how that works, because every team has been that I've worked on has always been a little different there. So let's see. Well, I have some experience making small games in Unity, and usually when I play video games, I tend to always explore and analyze levels. Good. Yes, I mean, it definitely helps to have a lot of knowledge, but again, it's tricky. Now at Ubisoft, they use their own engine. And there are some great videos on YouTube that talk about, how their various games are made. I'd say Ubisoft is probably on the bleeding edge, or one of the most advanced teams when it comes to their engines and their technology. And one of the things they've done is utilized a program called Houdini, for a lot of their teams, a lot of their engine. Houdini is a very, very, very advanced, very, very complicated engine, similar to, say, 3D Studio or Maya or other modeling packages. It's not a game engine like a Unity or Unreal. It's its own thing. It's very, very, very technical and really crazy hard to learn. And so Ubisoft, because it has its own proprietary engine and because of their integration with Houdini and what they can allow Houdini to auto-generate a lot of stuff for them, their level design process is very different, and it's also custom and unique. So they're not going to necessarily expect you to go in with hard knowledge of Unreal or Unity, because that's not what they're working in, right? So definitely keep up on studying level design in general and understand that the theory of level design there will be a big help for you. Now, a subset of this same job, the level designer, is what was often called a quest designer, and they're all kind of related to the, also a writer or somebody working on the story. So as a level designer on some teams, you might write some of the initial dialogue, the scripts. So there may be a big overarching story that a writer writes, but as a level designer, sometimes you are the guy who's also putting all the basic, like, secondary, tertiary quests together, and you might even write the dialogue for those quests, if you've got the skill set to do that. And so the level designer job does often require at least some basic writing knowledge or basic writing skills or the ability to do that. However, that being said, some of the teams, especially larger RPG studios and things like that. Hey, Jonathan, thanks for joining us. Good to see you here again. The job of the quest designer is often so big and so complicated, and how to implement quests and how many quests have to be implemented and the stories that have to be written for them, and how do you implement the dialogue systems back and forth, and how do you implement all of the different objects and the quest objects around the world, and making sure those are all active and live. And there's a lot that goes into making quests, especially for bigger, more open world and RPG type games. And so you will find that, say Blizzard, on the WoW team or things like that, actually have a sub job category of quest designer, which is related to level design, but you have to kind of work together. Whereas one guy is laying out the physical land surfaces, another guy is putting together the quests, the stories, the objectives, and then making sure again that all that works. For example, let's just say you have a more open world, RPG like WoW or something, or this is a typical problem with a lot of MMORPGs. One of the problems is that like say you have to kill X number of people within a level, right? Let's say it tells you to go kill 10 pirates in a level. Well, if I could run over and kill 5 of those pirates and they're already dead and they don't respawn, then when I go accept that quest is impossible to complete because there's already 5 pirates dead and they don't have, the extra 5, right? And so be careful about that and understand that's an important part of, of the quest designer is like making sure that those quests, can be completed, right? And so that's something that you need to be, aware of. Next is, the writer or the storyteller. So somebody who's doing the writing on a quest, or for the overall story arc, for cutscenes, that kind of stuff. Those could be a full-time role within the company, or they could be a part-time role at the company. And so you need to be aware that the writer and the storytelling often can be done by the creative director, and so a lot of times that falls into their lap. It could be again a dedicated writer, but obviously the writing and storytelling is kind of a subset of game design and something that has to be worked with the level designer. And again, all of these are kind of interrelated jobs and people that you would be working with, very closely. Next is a multiplayer designer. So I won't go into too much depth here, but this is somebody who specializes in multiplayer and understands what multiplayer is and all the specifics about how multiplayer works. And it's definitely its own specialized skills. This could be for both system design and level design, or a lot of different areas. And multiplayer could also include, MMORPG type, design, like live online stuff versus other stuff. So just be aware of, multiplayer. You will see jobs out there, that are actually specifically like hiring a multiplayer designer, and they're often looking for somebody that has that extra skill set, in understanding multiplayer game design, because it is definitely a lot harder than people think, a lot more nuanced than people think. When you want somebody to play a level over and over and over again, right? It has to be perfect, and that's what's really hard. There's kind of no room for mistakes there. I listed mobile designer as its own little niche. You'll find that a lot of between AAA, like PC console designers and mobile designers, live in very different worlds. The nuances of designing for mobile and free to play and understanding, a lot of the stuff that goes into mobile design. Some of it crosses over, but a lot of it isn't. And I definitely have had students that worked as mobile designers professionally and then tried to transition into AAA console and stuff, and they couldn't do it. They just didn't have the skill sets as designers, even after a couple of years of working in mobile. How you learn to do mobile design is very different. And so that's why I'm kind of putting that as a separate category, because, you even need to know things like user acquisition and, kind of the sales and marketing pipelines of how your game gets sold and how you get players in, how you acquire users, keep users, retention, all these kinds of things. There's a lot of acronyms in mobile design that you really have to understand deeply if you're going to be successful. So next we'll talk about kind of the usually the kind of top guy in the design side is usually the creative director. Depending on how big the company is, there could be a creative director and a lead designer. And as you get into studios like Ubisoft, you might have a lead designer for systems. You might have a lead designer for levels. You might have a lead designer for, each of these areas. And so you could have one creative director, or sometimes they're also called the project leads. But we'll get into the nuances of that in a minute. And generally in the hierarchy of things, there's usually a project lead, which could be the creative director, it could be an executive producer, it could be a project lead type person that oversees the entire project. And then typically that creative director reports to that person. The lead designers report to them. And then the other, from senior to junior designers, report, each into their leads. And so that's kind of the hierarchy of things. But the creative director, whether they're the project lead or not, is usually the visionary for the project. And they're usually the person that's really the idea guy, for lack of a better definition. That doesn't mean that all game design roles don't have some, creativity in them, but that the overall creative vision, the person that's going to keep it all cohesive, the person that's going to really be the driving visionary for the project is the creative director. And so depending on, how big or small your team is, that person can be really super overwhelmed. Like on Rainbow Six, I had, over 200 people reporting to me. I was the project lead and creative director, on that project. And just trying to manage 200 people every day, and what are they doing every day, and what are they working on, and is this stuff acceptable, things like that. It was just completely overwhelming. It was one of those jobs where, I was literally working probably 18 hours a day on average, and it just killed me, because it was just trying to manage a really large team like that by yourself. Is soul crushing, because it's so complicated. So while being the idea guy sounds like it's the cool job, and it sounds like, the job that everybody really goes in wanting, you'll quickly kind of realize on a lot of teams that's not the best job. It's by far the hardest. It's got all of the politics. You're the one dealing with all the external people, the CEOs, people like that are hammering on you to to do things, and you have to decide like, well, do I want to do that or not? Because if I do this for this person, it conflicts with what this person wants, or, if I do this, then it may not sell very well, those kind of things. You have to make the really hard choices as a creative director. And that's probably the hardest part of that job, really, is you have to have a lot of skill set across everything from being a good manager to being a good creative, and kind of being a jack of all trades across all these different things. But really the hard part of that job that people don't really understand is just, the politics and stuff of managing up, and dealing with the people above you, is a nightmare. And so, that's where, usually as a good creative director or project lead, I shield my team, from that. And so they don't always see the chaos. They don't understand, like, that we're often, maybe almost getting canceled or we're in big trouble. But, you have to kind of come in smiling and go, yeah, it's all great. Like, we're doing good. Like, just keep going, and you just got beat up for hours in the executive's offices, or in some meeting but you don't want the team to freak out, so you don't tell them. And so it can be a really challenging role. As a scripter or tech designer, this is also a subspecialty that this is quite often part of the game system designer's job and also the level designer's job. So in some cases, somebody has to do a lot of scripting, and so scripting can vary from engine to engine. It could be a scripting language like C# or Lua, Python, something like that, where you actually write almost semi-code, right? And you have to be somebody who can be very, very technical. This role is often people like somebody who might even be qualified as a junior programmer, or something like that, but they have a little bit of game design sense and smarts. And so this is a role that bridges game programming and game design. And this basically, we realize that, again, some game designers are really good at fun. Some game designers are good at art and fun. Some game designers are good at, technical and fun. But it's very hard to find a game designer who is part programmer, part artist, and part game designer. And they're usually not the best people because they're usually too jack of all trades if they have that way. But I definitely have trained and worked with a number of game designers who are ex-programmers, who just preferred to work in game design. So they switched over. So they are capable of doing their own scripting. But I've definitely worked with game designers who are mostly artists, and they have an amazing eye. And so they make amazing level designers, but they're not necessarily always capable of doing more advanced scripting and things like that. Now with the Unreal script and some of the new visual languages, it's made programming and scripting a little easier for a lot of things. And so some of those people now are able to get in and actually get their hands dirty on some of the more technical work. But again, this is a role that's not at every company. But there is some bigger teams and just some situations where this type of role is needed. And so again, this would be somebody who's very, very technical. You don't necessarily have to be a programmer. So I know scripters and stuff who do not know C or C++, that they did not go to programming school and get a degree in CS or something related, right? But they've got to be people that are pretty technical, really like know math and know at least scripting in that world and understand those differences, with that really well. So that's kind of what a game scripter does. So in short, I mean, this is kind of an overview of what game designers do. And again, people often ask me like what the difference between a game designer and a game programmer is, and really, again, except for the game scripter job that is almost a programmer and somebody that's kind of a junior programmer, the rest of these roles are creative roles. There are roles where you're coming up with ideas and you have to be at least a little technical, to be any of these jobs, and you do have to have some technical ability, but you're not a programmer. You don't work in code, and so like I said, you might work in some Unreal script or some scripting type stuff, but not in an actual like C or C++ language. And so your day-to-day job, your day-to-day life is about more coming up with ideas and making those work and making it fun. And it's a very, very different role, because you're kind of the glue that keeps the whole team together. Like you often are the people coming up with the ideas, and then you're telling the artists what to do, you're telling the programmers what to do, and you're kind of driving the whole team forward, right? And so that's that's an important thing. So you got to know how to talk to people. You got to have amazing, not good, but amazing communication skills, and things like that to be a game designer. Whereas like programmers, quite often, they can go lock themselves in a room. They can sit there and code all day long and never talk to anybody. And they're people that are more implementers, typically. Now, that doesn't mean that, again, we'll talk about gameplay programmers here in a minute that are also another type of programmer that cross over into design. And so we will talk about that role and how that crosses over a little bit, and that does change some things. But again, every team's a little different. Every company's a little different. But a lot of programmers like to be told exactly what to do. They don't want to think. They don't want to design. They don't want to figure out how some system works, right? They want a game system designer to tell them, like, this is how fast you run, this is how high you jump, this is how, fast this works and how much this works and how this works very precisely, so they can just go in and implement it. They don't want to be thinking about, like, oh gosh, how, you can't just tell them, like, make a character run, right? There's nuances there. Like, how do you touch and feel it and make it feel good, and how fast do you do it? That kind of stuff, right? It may not necessarily need to be an elaborate document, but you need to tell them how to implement and do their jobs quite often. But again, some programmers don't like that. So you got to learn as a game designer to give the rest of the team the information it needs to be able to do its job. And like I said, that varies dramatically from team to team. So you really have to kind of get in there and get to know your team, get to know your people, and figure out what they want and what they like, right? And so that's one of the challenges of being a game designer. Next, let's talk quickly about game production. So, the production is kind of the side of all the things that need to be done on a game that the other, kind of jobs don't encounter or handle. And so that doesn't necessarily mean that they do all those jobs themselves, but they're usually the direct liaison to the team, to everybody else and everything else that we'll talk about today. So generally, in your game team development room, you've got some producers, and then your designers, your artists, and your programmers. You might have a few others in there as well, but the game production staff are the people that are managing up to all the executives. They're the people managing out to all the outsource type companies or partnerships. They're usually the ones working with like sales and marketing. They're making sure that all the I's are dotted and the T's are crossed, and making sure all that stuff is happening. They're also usually the people that are in charge of the day-to-day scheduling and the production, just in general, and making sure you're hitting your milestones and that you're doing everything you need to do, making sure stuff gets, approved by legal or whatever else it is in that project. They're the ones thinking through all of that stuff. Now, an executive producer is the top, generally, producer within a company or organization. And that executive producer job really varies from company to company and team to team. And and one of the things that's important to sort of understand or know is that at some companies, especially at publishers, the executive producer generally is God. They generally have all oversight on kind of everything, and quite often that person, especially at a publisher, especially like an EA or something like that, the executive producer is over like a franchise or a set of projects. And so quite often executive producers are overseeing 2 to 4 projects or more at a time. And so they're spread a little thinner. So they are overseeing, again, like very high level, overview of the entire project. So whereas a creative director might be over the creative vision for a project, the executive producer is also managing, very high level schedules, very high level, monetization type, goals, the sales and marketing type stuff, things like that. So the executive producer is really overseeing the entire project vision, at the highest level. And generally they have final say on everything, and that's the way most companies work. But again, it just depends on the company. Sometimes the CEO is sometimes above that person and can make decisions, or somebody else might be above an executive producer. But very rarely, occasionally, like, you know, on some of my teams as a creative director or project director, I was actually above the executive producer in the hierarchy, and I was the one actually, you know, telling the executive producer, you know, what to do, or at least, you know, working with them is a dotted line partnership, you know, if anything, but, you know, in final say, you know, ultimately I had to say there. So again, it can be a little different, but because they're generally spread a little thinner or more high level, they're not digging down necessarily into the details. And so then you'll have like senior producers, is the next level below that. And the senior producer generally is kind of often the head of a project, depending on how big the team is or things like that. And they're, again, a little bit higher level where they're maybe not necessarily managing the day-to-day, second-to-second of things. But again, they're working on, again, a lot of the details at a much broader level. But they're handling just a lot of that stuff just to, again, make sure that things are getting hit. And then a game producer, or sometimes called a project manager, and especially in the more generalized software world, is often that person that's really that day-to-day person running the team. They're the ones that are talking to the team members every day, like, what did you work on today? What did you accomplish today? Where are you stuck? You know, at least on a weekly basis, but often on a daily basis. And they're really that person that's the glue and the grease that keeps the team running all the time. And so again, the skill sets for these people are very diverse. It's, you know, I could talk for an entire topic just on what a game producer really does, but they're really that person that just does everything else that nobody else wants to do, and they keep the ship going, right? And they're also like looking out for icebergs, you know, and making sure you're steering around those, and, you know, that kind of thing. And so they're very much a jack of all trades kind of skill set, and do a lot of stuff there. Now, at some companies like EA and other bigger companies, you also have what's called a development director. A development director is basically another kind of producer. But that development director, or DD, that we call them, is also kind of, we jokingly call a schedule monkey. So at most teams and most companies, the DD is the person who's 100% responsible for scheduling. And they remove that role from the game producer. And so because they realize that the team is so big, and the scheduling is so complicated on a lot of teams, a lot of projects, that you really need that role split, just because a producer by himself cannot do everything. And so the development director, if you see that title or see that role, is generally somebody who's kind of working in partnership with the producers, but managing just the schedules. And again, they may be reporting into an executive producer or somebody else an executive producer may be saying, well, I need to hit these big dates. Like, here's, you know, where alpha is, here's beta, here's launch, you know, and the DD his job is to make sure the team hits all those deadlines. But, you know, an executive producer may only be getting to report once a week or once a month, you know, from that DD about where the project is and how on schedule they are. The DDs might also be handling staffing, hiring, you know, that kind of stuff, again, to make sure that that's happening. Same thing with like budgeting. Quite often on some teams, the executive producer is the only one that sees the full budget and knows that. Whereas on other teams, sometimes the senior producer does budget, but very rarely does a game producer actually do budgeting. So a lot of times that the budget information is very sensitive, salaries to whatever else, you know, they may know for a particular thing, like that they need to outsource what budget is being handled there, but they're not seeing and tracking the entire project budgets and things like that. So that's another gray area that just varies from team to team, you know, company to company. So yeah, do many companies follow agile development, daily scrum meetings, etc.? Yes, I would say that 75% or more of the teams do follow an agile process. But their definition of agile can vary dramatically from team to team. And so whether they're running pure Scrum or to some other variant of agile, it varies. But a lot of teams do have their daily stand-ups, but quite often those get down to the sub-teams, right? So you might have like a stand-up for, you know, for just a particular level team or the systems team. So the bigger the company, the bigger the team, those stand-ups need to be small, right? They're supposed to be 20-minute type meetings, 15 to 30 minutes roughly at most for a stand-up. And so, so a lot of them do follow it. The problem I've seen, in working with a lot of teams and where I've had trouble when advising certain teams is that, quite often what ends up happening, the point of a stand-up and why you're standing, versus sitting and stuff like that is it's supposed to be fast. You're supposed to be quick, to get through everybody and just kind of like, what have you done today? What's blocking you, basically, is what a stand-up meeting is if you don't know. And so it's supposed to be to get you back to your desk and working as quickly as possible. But I've actually seen companies where they have so many stand-up meetings every day that literally a lot of the guys are in 6 hours or more of stand-ups, and they'll literally do, 10 or 20 stand-up meetings a day, because they got like, oh, I got to talk to this team and then this team and then this team and then this team. And it completely ruins the whole point of what a stand-up is supposed to be. In the end, everybody's just tired from standing all day, and things like that. So a lot of teams don't follow that methodology very well. Some teams understand it really well and can really manage it really well. So, some teams tend to control things more through producers, where a producer goes around every day and talks to each person kind of individually. Some teams handle it more through an email or a chat or Slack system, something like that. And then, if you guys don't know what waterfall is, waterfall development is kind of the opposite of agile. Agile is a system, if you don't know, where it's like the name implies, you're very agile and you're constantly, working on something and you iterate on it until you get it done. You move on, you iterate on it, you get it done. The problem with a lot of agile teams is they think that that's all you have to do, and they don't know how to plan ahead of time. And so they don't realize that they have to have X number of features done by a certain time period in order to launch the game and be competitive. And they'll often get stuck on like spiraling, trying to get one thing perfect, and they'll spend too much time there and ultimately, either fail to launch or deliver a subset of a game, whatever. Waterfall is kind of the exact opposite, where you plan everything ahead of time and you're much more process driven throughout it. And that works for some teams and some companies. But again, has its downfalls. And there's not really a right or wrong answer here. I find that my personal opinion on the subject is that I will make each team work within what is best for it at that time period of the project. And so sometimes I will shift my teams from an agile process into a waterfall methodology. So an example of that might be an art team, where say you create one character and you know that you have to create 100 of them in the game. Well, that first character might be a little hard to get done because you're like, okay, what's it going to look like? How's it going to function? How does it work? But once you've done one or two of them, you know what you're doing. And now to create the next 90 is really more of a waterfall process. And then it's just rinse, recycle, repeat. And you don't necessarily need to be agile because you just know like, okay, every character takes 2 weeks, and that's what it takes. And so it's more, that methodology can work better for say some art teams. Once you've gotten past the concept or prototype phase, they can shift. And so again, you'll see some teams now then using that hybrid methodology, where they may start as agile and then shift into more of a waterfall methodology as they get into production. So it's a hard question to answer. Sorry, it's very unique per studio, and again, every company can be super crazy, about these methodologies, or they can be very loose. And so just every team has figured out what works for them. The same thing with documentation. Some teams, their game design document can be 5 pages long, and some teams can be 500 pages long. There's not a right or wrong answer. It's what works for you and what works for your team, right? What's going to get you done on time, on budget, with the best game possible. And some teams have figured that out. Some teams are still trying, and that's really, what it's all about. Now, a subset of, you're welcome. So a subset that I've put into the game production category, it's almost its own category. It's almost game design, and it's kind of a gray area. So I threw it in here right now because it has a lot to do with production. But the product managers or PMs, now be careful because it gets confusing. You'll notice above the game producers, are also called project managers. And especially in the more traditional software world, if you go to a Google or Microsoft or somebody like that, you'll see the job title project manager used much more often than game producer or just producer, right? So the game industry, I think, is more likely to use the producer title versus project manager, but both are valid. The problem is project manager often gets also called a PM. And so be aware that sometimes some teams occasionally will get these two roles confused, and they're very different roles. And so, so make sure you're quantifying what a product manager is versus a project manager. And the project manager, again, is that generalist that does a little bit of everything. The product manager is really the data wrangler, and that person who, and this is more often seen in either live games, like MMORPGs, to mobile games. And so this job title is, I would say, 80 or 90% in the mobile world. But I think that the PC console world is beginning to understand, especially as we have more live games and live operations and free-to-play, you're going to see more and more of these roles exist in the PC console world. But you will see the vast majority of these jobs right now are in mobile. And what this person is really the person that works with a live game. Now, that game might be in alpha, it might be in beta, it may be fully live. So it doesn't mean that the game has to be live officially and launched. There's a lot of gray area in there. What it means is there's people playing the game, and those people playing the game generate data. And this person figures out, well, what data are we tracking? What data are we using? What data is important to us, right? And so the programmers then take, what this person wants and create, a series of checks or things that collect that data. So there's a database somewhere, usually an SQL database, and that database, then this product manager writes SQL queries to pull the data out. But they have to first tell the programmers, what data do I want to know? For example, how many times have you died? How long did you use this weapon? What did you do here? What levels have you played? All this kind of information that goes, especially into things like retention. And so what they'll often do is set up tests and set up stuff, and they're basically, my example that I use in an analogy is that the product manager is really that person who is the right hand of a game designer, a system designer. So they're there looking at data, giving us data as hard examples and proof of where our games are working or not working. And this would be the equivalent of, say, a game tester or QA person who is looking for bugs and finding problems, and they're giving that feedback quite often to the programming team, and they look for that. Again, they're finding hard data of, hey, this is broke here, so game programmer, go fix it. Now, that doesn't mean that bugs aren't in design or art too, but just kind of using that analogy of the game programmers rely on a QA tester to really find problems for them and give them the analytical data they need to fix that problem and understand it. In the same way, me, especially today as a game designer, as a mobile game designer especially, I can't live without a product manager, right? That product manager, PM, is that person who's helping me understand my players and give me hard data. And so as a game designer, I'm intuitively often using my heart, my instincts, my experience, and things like that to make decisions. But I rely on the PMs to basically give me hard data to help influence my decisions. And so some companies, like Zynga and stuff especially, are like 98% to 100% fully data-driven. They will make every decision based on pure data, and for better or for worse, make decisions, a lot of design decisions based on, their data analytics. But I still believe in that our experience and our heart and our, intuition as game designers is important. And so I think that not that they need to be equal, but it might be 70-30, where 30% of my decision is really my heart and my experience, and some of that's just what the data is telling me. But knowing how to interpret the data and knowing how to work with the data is an important part of a game designer's job. And so this product manager is somebody that works very closely with the game design team, but they're really, in more of a production role, if that makes sense. And then lastly, somebody else, if you're a small developer or on an internal development team, quite often there's also a publishing producer. And I bring this up just because sometimes these publishing producers are external and they may pop their head in once a month. Sometimes these are people embedded and they're working with you every single day. And their job and their role is to really understand from what the needs are from a publishing perspective, meaning, how's the game, the sales and marketing side of things and distribution, and they're working with tests, and they're working with kind of the publishing team in general to make sure the game is hitting its milestones or hitting its quality bars, things like that. And so sometimes that role of producer gets split between an internal producer, an external producer, or a publishing producer, and they may be overlapping a little bit, but they both kind of have slightly different needs, and they sometimes can conflict because, again, the publisher may be wanting one set of things, and the developer is like, no way, that's not what we want, right? And so these two producers kind of have to fight and work things out amongst themselves to figure out what the right solution is. And so there can be, a number of different, production jobs, out there. Next, we'll talk about game programming. Now, game programming, there's a lot of subspecialties. And so we'll try to talk about a bunch of those today. But the first of those is just what they also often will just call a game programmer. Now, similar to somebody being called a game designer, this is generally a generalist, right? Somebody who can work across a lot of systems, a lot of different areas. It can vary a lot from company to company. It varies tremendously also depending on if you're using your own proprietary engine as a studio, or like Unity or Unreal or a different game engine. So the needs of a programmer might vary a lot depending on the project itself and what that final skill set is, right? But a game programmer is typically somebody who's working in C, C++, and they're writing really fast, really efficient code. And that's generally their job, is they sit and work in Visual Studio or some kind of coding language, most of the day. Some game programmers might work with scripting, like we talked about. And so they might be working in a Python or Lua, or they might be prototyping some stuff in that and then converting it, into C or C++ that's a little faster. And then occasionally, very occasionally, there's other languages that they may be working in, including assembly language. I think that's becoming rarer and rarer, but but I definitely know some gameplay or game programmers who are really rendering or graphics guys that work, as we call it, to the metal. And that means that they're working directly with the hardware. The only reason you need to work in assembly usually is because it's the fastest language, and assembly is really, really, really hard to work in. Very few people can do it these days, but it's generally when you're writing directly to the hardware and need to write directly to the hardware that you'll have somebody do that. But again, the number of people doing that are really rare these days, because generally between DirectX and different, the hardware vendors and the game engines and things like that, 99% of that quite often now is covered through all these external APIs and things where you don't have to access the game, or the hardware yourself. You're accessing some API that tells you, hey, you need to access this feature, like some special rendering feature. You can just turn on and off, through a C or C++ call. You don't need to go write that thing in assembly language, but occasionally the top teams, again, will know how to use the hardware, perfectly or know how to optimize it. And that's why you'll see the difference of, like an internal team at Microsoft or Sony quite often will do a better job or push the limits of, the consoles better or things like that, because they really, really know the hardware inside and out. And they're able to do things at a custom level that, an external team may not have the time or knowledge, how to do. So again, a game programmer is generally, as they call it that, and there's different levels, again, from junior all the way to senior and lead levels that are there, and it just basically varies on the amount of responsibility you have as you go up your levels. With all these jobs, it's just, generally, a more senior person has a bigger area of responsibility, and then quite often will have reports to them. So you might start off having 2 people reporting to you, and then eventually you got 5 or 10. Just depends again on the game, or the team. And next is the gameplay programmer. We mentioned him a minute ago, him or her, and that person is the person that, again, kind of crosses into game design. And so this is generally a person who is a game programmer, but they generally have either picked up some inherent knowledge of game design just over the years, or have some inherent skill in it, or in some cases, even with my program, I've had game programmers come take my course specifically to learn game design, but they had no intention of becoming a game designer. Their intention was to become a gameplay programmer. And so by knowing more about game design, it allowed them to, and especially system design, it allows them to be a gameplay programmer. Now, the difference in a gameplay programmer in general is that that person is generally entrusted to actually make creative decisions about a feature. So, for example, a game designer might then tell a gameplay programmer, I need a flamethrower. And that's about all they tell you, right? And then the gameplay programmer goes out and implements the flamethrower in the way they think is best, and they implement it the way that they want it, and the way they think it would work, and that kind of stuff. And it doesn't mean that they can't go back and forth with some iteration with a game designer or ask them questions or something. But generally, when you have really good gameplay programmers, you don't have to, and you usually don't give them as much detail as a game designer. You usually let them, again, use some of their own kind of creativity along with their programming. So they're again somebody that's a really good, excellent programmer, but that can handle basic to advanced game design stuff, and be able to make decisions about game design and understand all the trade-offs and things like that. How to design like emergent gameplay, for example, versus more traditional game systems, things like that. So that's the kind of stuff that a gameplay programmer specifically would be handling. But again, to be a great gameplay programmer is somebody that you need to go to school and get a CS degree, have that computer science background, be a full-fledged programmer, knowing C, C++, things like that. You probably should also know some scripting. So depending on the engine and things, what scripting stuff you need, and then having some at least basic knowledge of game design systems and stuff like that is super helpful, if not critical, to have there as well. But again, that's kind of the difference between a game programmer and a gameplay programmer, is really just the amount of knowledge they have in game design. Now, the technical director, or TD, and there's a bunch of different job titles that kind of are in the same category, so I won't get into all of them, but there's a lot of like senior programmer type roles that they might be called TDs, they might be called something else, so just be aware of what a technical director usually is or it could be even a CTO level position or whatever, depending on the company, is generally somebody who's working on the architecture. Now, what that means is they're generally, a lot of the companies, a TD is not necessarily writing code. They are architecting the code, and they're working with a team underneath them. And so they're kind of that visionary that says like, okay, we need to have this system, this system, this system, this system, this system. We have these different APIs, we have these different things, and here's how they all are going to work together. Here's how they all function together. And here's what the big picture is for the programmers. And so the bigger your game gets, the more critical the TDs become, because they really are the ones that are kind of ensuring and even reviewing code and stuff like that to make sure that all the game programmers, gameplay programmers, and everybody else on the team are working well together, and that all these systems are going to come together to do what the company needs. And this can also include, you might have a TD or CTO type person who's looking across the entirety of all the game systems for the entire company, not just a single project. And so they may be architecting your own game engine, for example, and they need to make sure that game engine can work across multiple games or work for sequels, things like that. So they're again that kind of technical visionary who's ensuring a lot of that type of stuff that's going to be important to the game. Next is this is that some game engines and rendering graphics programmers, things like that, exist. So the game engine programmers or your rendering graphics programmers, people like that, it may be roughly 30% of the companies have their own proprietary engines. So these could be somebody that comes along and either makes the engine from scratch, or it could be somebody that is, taking the existing engine and modifying it, making it better, whatever that is, making the rendering better or different, like adding cell shading onto a renderer, that may not have it, things like that. But these could also be guys who are working in Unreal or Unity, and they're specialists in that specific game engine, and they're actually working to write custom code and custom tools and things, within that game engine to make the game engine perform better or more optimized. So again, not every single team is necessarily going to have this, but these are generally specialists within, the game engines themselves. But as Unity and Unreal have become more popular, as well as other third-party engines that are commercial, the need for a game engine programmer or a whole series of these guys has become less and less. But again, a lot of teams are still doing their own custom engines, and so. But especially like graphics programming, you get into like multi-threading and, and a bunch of these kinds of areas where you deal with like multi-core CPUs, GPUs, all these types of things. That technology is just leapfrogging itself like constantly. And so you're somebody that's there that's always trying to optimize for the platform, whether that's different PCs at different eras, and how those change over time, or whether it's, somebody else who's working on, a specific aspect of an engine that maybe doesn't exist. So again, that job can be pretty varied. The next is a tools programmer. Now, if you guys don't know, it's getting fuzzier and fuzzier with each generation of game engines. But the game itself, you need a tool or a set of tools to build that game, especially for game designers. And so that could be, anything from a combat tool, as we call it, or a combat animation tool, where you're going in and doing the animation for characters and setting up the combat systems, like for a fighting game, and how fast punches are struck, and when, where the hit boxes and collision boxes are, that kind of stuff. Some teams will build that into like their existing engine, whether that's Unity, Unreal, or their proprietary engine. And some teams, especially for level design, will quite often build that, into their own standalone tool. It could be literally its own executable, its own program, and it may take, and import in a bunch of art from the game engine or out to it. But again, there's a lot of specialized stuff when it comes to like making quests and things like that. But again, most teams are starting to just integrate all of that into Unity and Unreal. And so the need for standalone tools programmers has become less, but again, they're still needed. There's still always going to be, tools for importing and exporting art the correct way for that thing, or for, again, making custom, features for the game, and then how the team interacts with the game engine, and even tools just to optimize their production, to make things work faster or better, whatever that is. There's generally, like I said, standalone tools or tools within, or plugins within, other game systems or things like that somebody has to write and somebody has to create. And so these are guys who write other programs or other tools or other things like that allow the team to work and either do their job at all or make their jobs more efficient, if that makes sense. So the next, job that I'll call it, which is very similar to the game engine job, but they're really a different specialty, are the platform specialists. And so with every platform, whether it's Xbox, PlayStation, PC, Windows, to even in mobile devices, going between Apple and the Google platforms, every hardware system, even VR, whatever that is, every hardware system needs to be optimized. And so a lot of teams, especially a larger team, will have, maybe one person for each platform. It could be one person who handles all the extra platforms, but basically they are working with the game engine and the teams to make sure that everything works correctly on the platform as you go out to it. And so again, like Unity and Unreal are doing better and better and better every year to allow you to export out and make your game run on all these platforms. But quite often you still need a specialist who really understands the inside and outs of each platform and how to optimize for it. And if you just rely on Unity or Unreal to do that, then you may only be getting 70% efficiency in a lot of your output. And so teams that need to do more advanced games or push the limits a little bit faster may want a platform specialist on there. Next are a whole series of different jobs. So you have a physics programmer. And again, this person may write the physics engine from scratch. They might use an off-the-shelf physics system that comes with the game engine, and they again may be writing the stuff from scratch, versus they may be working with the game designers to help them implement stuff, and making sure the physics and collisions and things like that are all kind of working. And so again, this is generally somebody who has probably a degree in physics and understands the math and the science beyond just the programming side of things. And so again, it's a little bit more specialized. The next are AI programmers. This is a very vague, very huge topic. I mean, as you probably know, there's a lot of programmers, a lot more AI programming going on. There's a lot of different areas of the AI programming that are happening. And so it's hard for me to cover because every team is so different in how it does its AI. But this is somebody who specializes in all aspects of AI within the game and the game system. Sound programmers, might help program, either from scratch or utilize an existing, again, game, sound system, like Fmod or something like that. They may help integrate that, and they may help, with the integration of sounds and things like that. Quite often, this is a subspecialty of a game programmer. And so not a lot of teams these days would have a full-time sound programmer, but occasionally a game does. So this could be a full-time role, but quite often also, same with physics. Sometimes these are just subspecialties under a general game programmer, and so especially a smaller team may not have a full-time version of all these things. The scripting programmer, again, kind of like we talked about the game design scripter, is generally somebody who runs and manages the scripting system, and they make sure that the scripts are optimized. They make sure the scripts are running correctly. They would help, say, game designers or other people with their scripting if they needed it. And so generally these are people that work back and forth between, say, C++ and the scripting language within the game, and they're doing a lot of that level of optimization, because whether, it's an artist writing a script for a texture, or a game designer writing scripts for AI or whatever it is, quite often those are not written to be the best. And so this person really helps optimize a lot of that stuff and keep the game running fast. UI is another area that's been weird over the years. Like UI, there's never been a great, perfect solution. I used to work for Scaleform. It was the evangelist for Scaleform. And if you don't know, Scaleform was a system that allowed you to use the Flash, Adobe Flash system, their tools and all their stuff to create UI in Flash, and then it allowed you to bring that into, Unreal and different engines and use that stuff. So there was a pipeline for the artist all the way through to implementation of the code. I still find the whole UI, UX tools and things like that, they're just kind of all over the place. It's still pretty Wild West on how it works. So whether you're utilizing an existing system within a current engine, what I believe Scaleform is still available through Autodesk today, but I don't know. They were talking about switching over to HTML5 versus Flash. But either way, UI has to have, how do you go from implementation all the way, to making it work in the game. And there's somebody generally has got to do some work there. And so that's one of those gray areas. Again, some teams will try to use off-the-shelf stuff, but there's usually somebody, again, that's got to work somewhere there. And quite often, again, this would be a subspecialty of just a general gameplay programmer. But on some teams, it's a full-time job. So it just really depends. Networking, again, same thing. Just anybody that works on any of the networking code, whether that's for mastering multiplayer games or just normal networking stuff, whatever. And again, a lot of engines have this networking built in, but sometimes you need to have a better solution, a more optimized solution, or a different solution, or you're writing your own, code. So you need to just be aware of, there's quite often, most teams generally have some kind of a networking specialist to really keep the networking working well. And then this person in networking can also be on front end or back end, meaning like the code that's kind of going out to the world, but there's also quite a bit of back end stuff that has to do with networking. This could be databases. This can be, stuff that's like for security, anti-hacking, a lot of things. So networking is a pretty big bucket that has a lot of different jobs kind of encapsulated within it. Let's see. So Unity uses C#, Unreal uses C++. Unreal, they both use C++ under the hood. Unreal actually uses what's called Unreal Script, and that's their equivalent of the C#. And they're both working on both text versions and graphical versions that are equivalent, but both the C++ is the coding language actually that under the hood, all Unity, Unreal, and I think as far as I know, all proprietary game engines are using C++ is really the standard language, for all of those. And some, so we need to kind of, you have to kind of understand that there's a difference between a programming language and a scripting language. So try to understand that. And so, again, most proprietary systems are using C++ as their core programming language. But then as their scripting language, I've seen everything under the sun from Python and Lua being probably the most common. But I've seen people write their own custom proprietary scripting languages and everything else. So really anything's popular. But if you're not sure what to learn, I recommend learning Python. That seems to be at least fundamentally similar to everything else. And if you know Python, it's not too hard to go learn Lua or something else that's similar. And then finally, animation programmers. Again, these are one of these subset specialties that may or may not be needed for your game. If you have a fighting game or something that's has a lot of animation, a lot of combat, things like that, this is somebody that helps goes in and makes sure that the animation of your characters or anything else in the world are done well, that they function, they're smooth, that things get blended really well, that the animations know how to play properly, things like that. So again, this is a whole other subspecialty that might be included in a generalized game programmer. If your game has really light animation, then what's built into say Unity or Unreal or your engine may be fine. But again, the more intensive the animation systems are within a game programming or game animation, then you might end up having a full-time person who's just responsible for the animation systems. Let's go into game art. Kind of like game programming, this is a tricky field in that there's a million different game art jobs out there, and there's a lot of kind of subspecialties and things like that. But let's kind of talk about them in general. And again, that you have to be careful because there's a lot of kind of like game design and game programming. There can be a lot of subspecialties where they may just say they want a game artist. And it's like, well, are they looking for a 2D artist? Are they looking for a 3D artist? Are they looking for an animator, a generalist, things like that. And so if you see a job title that's just game artist, you really need to dive into that if you're an artist, and you need to understand like what are they really looking for, there, because again, the three really basic areas are 2D, 3D, and animation. And we'll talk about some subspecialties within those. But so some people may want you to know all of that, and some people may want you to know part of that, right? And so you do need to kind of know what your skills are and stuff. And 2D can go beyond just especially in animation and things like that. 2D can be like doing literally animated 2D stuff. So like in sprites, or doing a 2D game that's animated. So like literally like every frame of a character, is drawn, and you're playing the sprites back and forth. And so you need to know how to animate in 2D, can be the same or it's a similar, set of skills to being a 3D animator, but the skill set's very, very different. I mean, yes, you have to understand motion and how things move, but one person's drawing a bunch of stuff frame by frame, another person is working with a 3D character and a skeleton. And so, so again, even if they say that you have a 2D, you're a 2D artist, make sure you understand what do they want. You know, are they looking for a concept artist who draws things conceptually? You know, and that, you know, maybe somebody who does matte paintings and background paintings and, you know, or just concepts and things like that. To, you know, again, 2D artists can be a wide variety of stuff, from people that just do concepts or textures and, you know, and basic 2D art, all the way to people that, again, are doing 2D animation and things like that. And so having great skills as a 2D artist is usually important to become a 3D artist. But it really just depends on, again, the team and the project. And again, like concept artists even can fall into some categories of people that are really good, like fast sketch concept artists, and people that can do really good creative ideas, all the way to people that, again, do like matte paintings and backgrounds and like super hyper realistic, like super, you know, high resolution type stuff that's very detailed. And so the job of even a concept artist can vary a lot from team by team. And then where it gets even more complicated is the style of how you draw. Quite often can be very different. So one artist may be really great at like cartoony stuff. Another person may be really great at like more photorealistic stuff, and even do kit bashing or photo bashing, you know, where you're putting different pictures together, versus, you know, some people are better at one thing or another. So you do need to know, even in the 2D world, like, what are you good at? You know, some 2D artists are really good at characters. Some are good at environments. Some are good at both. You know, and so every 2D artist and every artist have to build skills either in one or two specific styles or genres, or they have to try to become a generalist and really practice a lot. But again, the skill sets between going to some, you know, from something that's super cartoony to something that's super realistic or anything in between, are very different, right? And even the skills of drawing characters or doing characters versus environments are very different. And so not everybody does everything. So you may be a specialist that just says, like, I'm amazing at, you know, like doing Disney style characters, and you can draw those all day long and animate them and stuff like that. But that doesn't mean you're going to be an amazing, you know, concept artist for drawing out, you know, some village or some ultra modern city or something like that. So there's definitely, a lot of differences in the type of artist you can be and the skill sets you need here. And so just be aware of that. That's kind of like in game design, where, you know, one guy might be a specialist in first-person shooters, and one might be a specialist in, you know, RPGs or, you know, or driving games, whatever that is, sports games. It's the same kind of nuance in game art, where, you know, the skill set and the skills you've built over time require you to work in that and have done lots of studies and examples and done a lot of practice in those particular areas. Otherwise, you probably don't have necessarily the production skills to do that type of game. And so it can be hard, because you may be amazing on one project, and then the next project comes along, which is a totally different project. And I've seen artists lose their jobs over this, or have to get transferred to other teams and things because they didn't have the right skill set to go to that next project. And the same thing with game design or even programmers. You just sometimes get caught where your skill set isn't relevant from project to project, and that gets really tricky. So the next set of jobs are the 3D modelers. And the 3D modelers are people who make the 3D models. You're working usually in Maya or 3D Studio Max or some kind of modeling program. And I know some people who specialize just in that building that mesh, and they don't texture it. And so that's really dangerous, in that, you know, that building that 3D model is definitely a skill set, but not knowing how to texture it can be dangerous. And so that's why you see the job of texture artist is kind of a separate thing. It's better to be both a 3D modeler and a texture artist. But on bigger teams or in some particular cases, those jobs do get separated out. So be aware of that, you know, I think if you're studying to be an artist and a 3D artist, you definitely need to be a great texture artist as well, in my opinion. But be aware that sometimes you will see people who are specialists in just 3D modeling or just texture art. And so that can be tough. The next thing to understand is that in 3D modeling, there's kind of two schools. One is hard surface modeling, and one is soft surface modeling. And there's different techniques like NURBS and things like that for doing soft surfaces. And soft surfaces would be characters, you know, and things that are very organic, right? And so you'll find that, these days there's a lot of 3D programs that are designed more for almost like you're working in clay, and so you're sculpting these things, versus so it's more of like a skill set of being a sculptor versus being an architect and building a house, right? And so it's those things where they're related, but again, the skill set to be a really great character artist and know how to sculpt in the various sculpting packages that are out there can be very different. Same thing, a hard surface modeler who's doing hard surfaces, meaning, generally like buildings or vehicles, props, things that are very, polygonally based, very rigid based, again, have generally a very different set of skills, because the tools that you typically use to do hard surface modeling, generally in games, it needs to be more efficient. And therefore the tools you use, you're worried about every polygon, you're worried about how optimum and efficient these things are. And it's a slightly different set of optimized skill sets there, between, characters, props, and environments. So again, some people are generalists and can do all three. Some people specialize in one, and it's okay to specialize, but just be aware of, again, you're limiting your job capabilities sometimes, a lot if you do that. Also, lastly, before we move on from texture artists, one of the things that's really changed in the texture art world is it used to be that back in the day, 20 years ago, 10 years ago even, like we would have like a color map, which was just the texture, meaning the color and what it was going to look like, right? Whether it was photorealistic or whether it was cartoony, whatever, but that was the color that went on it, and that was all we had. And then as textures became more and more complex, now a single object or character or whatever might have even 10 different maps on it, the bump maps, like how rough the surface is, how shiny the surface is, all the different, things from translucencies, reflectiveness, all these things can be a different map. And then how that is all put together in the game engine, especially in Unreal that has a very, complex shader system and things like that, that really now there's a whole nother specialty, which are often the shader artists. And those are the people working in the game engines to implement, these complex stuff. And they often have to have a kind of a bit more of a technical background, and sometimes need to be a bit capable in scripting and other types of things to bring those textures in from, a third-party tool into your game engine and make them look and function right. So just be aware of that. If you're becoming a texture artist, you need to know how to build and create those great textures in, your original tool. Again, 3D Studio or Maya or something similar to that. But you also need to know how to build it or recreate it or optimize it in the game engines themselves these days. And that's really probably the harder skill set at some levels. One's more artistic, one's a little bit more technical, but those are really needed on both sides. The next one are kind of the level artists and world builders. Now, these are really the people, they may be the same people as the 3D modelers, but quite often there's a subspecialty of the person who works in the game engine to actually implement the art in the game engine. So they may not actually model anything themselves. They may not actually texture anything themselves. They may take pieces of art. This would be especially true at Ubisoft or a bigger company, where they're going to take somebody else's art and then they're going to work with a level designer, and they're going to potentially go in, a level designer may say white box something out and have something there, and then the level artist, is going to go in and make it look really pretty, So there's a bunch of different stuff related to how a level artist, or what we often call world builder, works with a level designer. And again, both these jobs can be very related, and in some cases they can be the same person. In some cases there can be 2 or 3 or 4 people there. And so it really just depends on the complexity of it. But especially as you get into more photorealistic levels, that level artist, world builder person really has to know, like, well, how do I build this level? How do I make it look realistic? Or how do I make it look natural? You don't just plop a building anymore down on a mesh and just make it and have it look good on most games. Now, sometimes that may be all you have the capability of, but especially as you get into, say, Ubisoft level, type open world games or whatever, you're putting a house down, you're putting trees around it and a fence around it and some flowers, and, you're lighting it and stuff like that. That's actually, one of the specialties I actually forgot on here that a lot of teams have is the game lighter, or the lighting artist. And so that person may be the person who's putting all the lights in the game. And again, this job does not exist at every team. So again, a lot of these level artists, world builders, are also doing the lighting. But there is some teams, I know like at Insomniac when I was there and stuff, that we actually had a specialist who just did lighting. And so they would go in and place every single light in the game. They would adjust the colors of the light. You know, they'd make sure all the lighting was getting baked in correctly or getting done in real time correctly, that it was casting shadows in the right way, and that kind of stuff. So again, lighting can be another part of the world builder job, or it can be a subspecialty, again, as well. Next is the animator, or rigger. We talked about this kind of in the beginning. But it's that person who basically first has to set up the skeleton within a character and set up a character so it knows how to move. And it's and really good TDs, that know how to set up a character properly, will actually set up their tools in such a way that the animators can't actually screw up a character. So for example, like you don't want your arm to be like this and get all strange, and get all twisted and warped. And so the TD will actually put limits and say like, okay, this arm can only raise to this much, and it'll stop, literally physically stop an animator and not allow it to go any higher. And then they can set up stuff like for physics and things just to make sure that as like a ragdoll takes over, that the character doesn't get all weird and twisted and bizarre and things like that. And so a really good rigger is not just setting up a basic skeleton. It's actually a much harder job where you're actually, in your game engine and stuff, setting up tools and rules and all these kinds of things that allow you to even automate some of the stuff, work with engineers that can, automate certain things like, say, blinking of a character, or like facial animation, that could go with it. Like hand and facial animation is very complicated. These guys might be working with hand animation. They might be working with motion capture. So each of those is its own specialty. Like cleaning up motion capture is definitely a subspecialty, within this whole thing. And so, and that's a very different set of skills than somebody who animates from scratch. So just be aware of that all these are basically the people that, make the characters or anything in the world, even if it's a weapon, right? That weapon may be hard surface, but it may be, every time I pull the trigger, there may be an animation of a slide coming back, and then it may be combined with, say, a visual effects artist where, that slide comes back, some smoke goes out the barrel, you see a bullet eject out, which is a visual effect, but that slide may have to go back and forth, and some other kind of animation may happen on the gun. And so, so don't think that this is specific to characters. It could even be a flag that's on a flagpole that's floating or whatever. There can be lots and lots of things in a game beyond characters, creatures, and things like that need to be animated. But those are generally simpler, and some of that's done through programming, some of that's done through an actual animator. The visual effects guys are the people who are, as the name implies, doing all the visual effects. So that's going to be like fire and smoke and just anything that's going to be, potentially like sets of particles, or it can be lasers, it can be whatever, but they're doing those things that kind of turn on and off, just for a little bit, or things that are big billows of smoke and whatever. And so they're the ones kind of responsible for setting up all that kind of stuff in the game. And again, generally, making it work in real time, making sure it's efficient, making sure it looks good from all angles, things like that. So again, sometimes a general artist will do this work. Sometimes an animator will do this work, but usually these days, most teams will have a specialized visual effects person or multiples, to help them. Next is the technical artist. And so a tech artist is kind of, again, is the person that crosses into the programming world. And these are people who are generally probably have a degree in programming or some, pretty advanced technical skills when it comes to, being able to work in C, C++, understanding tools, understanding all the pipelines. And their job is to make sure that the game art gets into the game correctly, is optimized, working efficiently, looks right, and is doing everything correctly. And so these guys are some of the hardest to find, and they're worth their weight in gold, because there's always some kind of problems between the art team and the game engine, and just getting things back and forth, and or even getting things from, say, Maya into Unity, and then working correctly in the game, like that import process and how to get those things imported or whatever. And so every team I've worked on has always had a tech artist, at least one. And sometimes I want 5 of them. I mean, they're really rare, but again, they're that person who's bridging the gap between the programming world and the art world. Now, if you don't have a tech artist, sometimes a programmer can handle this job and will handle this job. But the problem is they don't usually have time allocated to really do it 100%, and they don't always know the game art side of things. So when you start talking and looking at the really, really detailed code for like how to import and export models, and animations and get it all right, they got to kind of go figure that out a little bit. Not every programmer really gets art, 3D art, that kind of stuff. So that can be tricky. Next is the art director, and the art director is the person who's overseeing the total vision for the art. And this is where it gets tough, because a lot of artists or lead artists who become art directors aren't prepared. And I've had this at many companies where they weren't prepared to be an art director, kind of like a creative director. They're overseeing the vision for the whole thing and how does it look, the style, and making sure it's all cohesive, and things like that. And so they're directing, say, the concept artists and the other people to, and they're managing this whole thing, and they're not necessarily the implementers. And I definitely have had trouble with a lot of artists who try to become art directors, and they don't get the fact that the job's different, right? So just be aware of it's a very different job. I'm not going to get into that right now, because you're not going to ever start as an art director day one. That's a job you learn over time. But just know that job is really important, and it's definitely a much harder job and a different job than most people understand. I won't really talk about the executive roles as we're running out of time, but just know there's a whole layer of bureaucracy and management above you. And that could be 2 or 3 levels above you. It could be, 50 levels above you. But either way, these people all influence the project. They all have opinions. They all put pressure on. They're all wanting certain things. And so you need to be aware of, again, you're not going to step into these roles necessarily right from the start, but all of these executives above you all definitely have a, thank you, Matthew. I appreciate it. These executives all definitely have an effect on the team, right? And you have to be aware that they exist, and you have to be aware that they need to be happy. And that's the hard part for any team members. So other production roles, there's a million other roles out there. Now, some of these, depending on the team, can be contractors, can often be part-time people, consultants, things like that, that maybe aren't on the project 24/7. They may be across multiple titles at one company, and so you're sharing them, and they might be a shared resource. They may be on your project just for a few months. So it really just depends on, again, the project's needs. Like I've been on projects where I've had 1 or 2 sound guys full time for the whole project, and I've been on projects where I had 1 sound guy just for a few months. And so it just really depends on, again, the budget, the team, and the needs and the complexity of these things. But generally, in the sound department, you have people that do the sound effects in the game, the people that do the interface, sound noises, and then you'll have different roles. Quite often the job title, like sound engineer, is actually somebody who makes the sound. So they have to create the sound, and then they have to then go into a tool generally and know how to compress it, know how to set it up in the game engine, know how to trigger it. They may actually be going in and working with the designers and actually implementing that sound and making sure that every footstep, every gunshot, everything is triggered correctly, and things like that. So this sound team can quite often be kind of a right hand of the game design team as well, and be people that are working very closely with the game designers and and all the other departments to really make sure that all the audio is not only being created from raw, from scratch or through sound libraries or whatever you've got, but they're also implementing that stuff. And even things like music may sound like it's really simple, but a lot of games use dynamic music. And so you have to understand, where programs like Fmod and how they actually will create and change the music over time. And they have to understand, how does their stuff loop together and work together and blend together such that the sound might get more dynamic and more, may get more intense as you go into a battle, and then may slow down a bit, things like that. So this can be a very highly technical role, both on understanding how audio works, but also like the tools and the stuff that you need to use. Interface design, which we talked about, again, is it's a really complicated role. We'll have to do a whole class on it, to be honest, because it really is about being part game designer, part artist, part, implementer, and sometimes programming as well, and how the interface works. So the interface design role, and especially the UX version, is a whole separate skill set that most game designers don't actually know. Some may pick it up over time, but there's entire jobs, especially in the more common general software world, where the UX designer is just literally, their entire job is the user experience and the functionality of this stuff. And that gets often in conflict with the game design, and then that gets in conflict with how it visually looks, and then that gets in conflict with how you can implement it based on the code and the tools. So that's where sometimes this job is one person, but quite often it could be, again, 2 to 4 people. So it really just depends on the company and the complexity of the interface in the game. And some teams even have multiple interface designers. So depending on what their needs are. Business intelligence, or BI, they're the market research people. These are more commonly found, again, in mobile teams, I find. But again, these can be part of a publisher or something else, but they're basically are people that go and analyze the entire business. They analyze how revenue is made, how sales are going to be done, and then we'll give feedback to you, kind of like a product manager, which we talked about earlier, and they'll be kind of part of that team where they're helping the design team or the executive team or the production team make decisions about the product based on what they think the business is going to be and what's going to make the most sales, and they'll be advising kind of in that kind of capacity. Next is sales and marketing and user acquisition. So just, this is quite often, to be honest, sometimes the most important people on the team. Now, us as the developers are quite often arrogant about that, and we often will put the sales and marketing guys kind of like, oh, they're not part of the core team. They're just the guys that sell it, and whatever. Like, we make a great game, they sell our game. Like, we're the most important people because we make the game. But in reality these days, especially in mobile, your sales and marketing and your user acquisition teams are actually kind of the most important people in the room. Getting the game out, getting it sold, and keeping that stuff. Yes, the development team needs to make a great game, but if you look at even the budgets these days, quite often in the beginning, it used to be kind of a 1-to-1, like the amount of money we spent on production was equal to the amount of money we spent in sales and marketing. But I see a lot of teams now that are often 10-to-1, 20-to-1. So they're if you spent $1 million to make your game, the sales and marketing team might have $10 million to spend, right? So like they have 10x the responsibility financially that you do, and so just be aware of that there is differences in what those roles do, and it's really important that you don't, if you're part of a development team, don't discount the sales and marketing guys. Don't wave them off as a bunch of guys that don't know anything or that they're not important or stuff like that. You need to listen to them. You need to work with them. You need to make them part of your core team and not just treat them as outsiders. And finally, the last slide, there's a lot of, I'll call them support roles, and they're still part of the core team, but again, it doesn't mean they're not important, but they're not necessarily part of the development team, and so the development team, is the people we've just talked about. These other support teams are still critical, they're still important, but again, they're seen as kind of outsiders to the production team, and so this can be, the guys that are doing all the QA testing, the bug testing, usability testing, focus testing, that kind of stuff, making sure the game is solid. They can be a release manager who's helping like the game builds get done. So making sure that the source code of the engine is going from there and getting out to the world correctly. That each build is done, whether it's on a daily basis or weekly basis or whatever, and that those get over to the QA teams or get out to production or whoever needs to have them. But somebody needs to make sure the game's getting released properly, and that's generally its own job. But sometimes it's one of the programmers, but quite often it is its own role. if you're shipping worldwide, you need to have somebody that's helping with translation, localization, and globalization, which is understanding that the entirety of a game needs to be relevant to a culture. You know, and there's certain things that, you know, certain animations or certain pictures or certain symbols that you have to realize that you have to be very careful about, because they may, you know, if you're an American and all you know is American culture, you may accidentally do something that, you know, you think is like, you know, really cool. And then, you know, in another culture, they're like, oh my God, I can't believe you just did that. Like like that's the most offensive thing you could ever say or do or show, you know, and you have to be careful about that. A good example were things like blood, used to be in Germany, forbidden. And so I still remember on like games like Command and Conquer, we had to change our manual, and we had to change the color of the blood, and we turned it to black. And we basically, you know, referenced that we're not fighting people. The humanoid characters were actually robots. And so when they died, it splattered oil. And so we had to change that for Germany, because we were not allowed to show blood in Germany for a very long time. That law has now since changed. But again, these laws can change year by year. And so you have to be very careful about what's, you know, culturally relevant to these people. And then finally, just, you know, the people that make the team work, you know, your HR and your accounting people that hire you, fire you, and pay you, you know, are very important as well. The business development guys who are out there, you know, trying to get the next deal, they're trying to get the deal signed. They may even be doing a lot of stuff like working with licensors or things like that, although that's quite often the job of a producer. But again, there's a lot of kind of biz dev guys out there who, especially if you're at a small company, they're keeping you fed. They're keeping you with projects, and you know, and you got to really give them credit, because biz dev is a really hard job. You know, to be out there and be that salesman, you know, for your company, right, to get the next project. And finally, just the legal team. You know, again, don't discount how important legal is. Making sure that your game is you know, legally acceptable and doesn't break any laws, and, you know, doesn't do anything bad, and meets all the other approvals and things like that, is critical. And some teams forget about legal. And in fact, I was at a company that was a very, 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 very big company, and the producers had forgotten to check with legal, and we were ready to ship the game. And I was like, well, do we have sign off from legal, which I knew was required by that company. And they were like, oh no, we forgot to ask. And it took us almost, I think, 3 or almost 4 months to get legal sign off on the game. And it killed us. Like, the executives were so angry because that one mistake basically, you know, cost us many months of time. So don't underestimate the importance of legal and legal sign off on your games, because that can kill you. Anyways, that's it for today. If anybody has any last minute questions, please let me know. But otherwise, thanks again, everybody, for joining. Hopefully this was, you know, helpful and insightful to everybody, and helps you, you know, kind of understand the dynamic of an entire team and how they're kind of working together and what each job does and kind of how they differ. So hopefully this helped everybody. And otherwise, everybody have a great week and be safe. And thanks again. Bye now.